Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. As Ju's laid out there, there's quite a lot to cover in the next half an hour, and I'll make sure that I try to keep us to time. But of course, when I talk about these sorts of issues, it's always good to start with the bigger organizational context, and hopefully I can pull up the slides here. Let's see what happens. Can we get? Yeah, there we go. So I think in some ways it goes without saying we are in extraordinary times of change, and I've been talking about the issues of the future of work and change for many years, and of course we've seen big drivers such as globalization and political change. We may yet see more of that today, of course, but a lot of these debates about the future of work being driven by a changing political and geopolitical environment. A lot of social and demographic change as well, in new generations perhaps of different expectations of the world of work, but also aging populations in the West and a lot of other things that we have to understand, because they also set the context for organizations and indeed some of the risks that I will talk about. And technological change, which is over recent years being talked about so much more as a real driver and a force for the future, where many of the jobs that we do today are expected to change dramatically. The Bank of England, notably a few years ago, said they thought that as many as 2/3 of the jobs that young people would do who are now at school have not yet been invented. So we've got a lot of different changes which are already driving organizational thinking and the future of work. And then, of course, layer onto that not just the pandemic, but the environmental crisis and the Extinction Rebellion movement, and I think a real recognition for organizations everywhere that these are agendas that we have to step up to. They are all about being responsible businesses and the sort of multi-stakeholder view of the world, where we understand our responsibilities as businesses is not just to make money, but it's to do so in ways that are supportive of the societies and communities of which we are part, that we're looking after our customers and suppliers appropriately, and not least, of course, that we're looking after our employees effectively. And of course, many of these things are driving a time of significant economic challenge and change as well. And we don't know where that's all going to really land at this point in time. I think we're still in, of course, trying to understand the immediate short-term impacts of the pandemic. So, the pandemic itself unquestionably has put a lot of these questions of organizational resilience and people's resilience to the front and center of the agenda. And if I take it first from the ideas of individual resilience, of course, a lot of concerns about individual well-being. And this, I've long believed, should be on every corporate agenda. I think the well-being of our people is not just a risk issue. It is a fundamental issue about driving our businesses in ways that sustain people. And of course, during the pandemic, what we've all seen is that we're all staring into each other's living rooms and we're all engaging more in the conversation about how you're feeling. And that is really, really important. And I think over recent years, we've seen a lot of growth in discussions, and indeed we as a profession, the HR profession, very involved in these discussions about things like mental health as well as physical well-being. And the pandemic undoubtedly is reinforcing those sorts of questions of personal resilience, and then how we adapt our organizations, all these sort of big questions that you can see on the slide. So the pandemic of itself, of course, has driven an awful lot of need for adaptability, for agility, for resilience. And as I talk to HR leaders and business leaders, for the most part, they're saying, we've done things in weeks and months that would have taken us years to do in the past. We've had to respond, the old adage of necessity being the mother of invention. And there's a lot, and I really believe this, that we can take forwards from this pandemic as we work our way through it, which can be positive forces for change. But of course, in the meantime, we're all trying to adapt to a very fast changing world, as I've said. So the next things just to talk about are some of the direct impacts on things like areas of skills and capabilities. I like this slide because that could be interpreted in lots of ways, but it is what's the future? And this quote that has been variously attributed to Niels Bohr, Mark Twain, Sam Goldwyn, and many others. It's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. But I think what this also calls out, that this is now a time when we can help to shape the future, because so many of the things, as I've already touched on, that coming out of the pandemic are things that we can act on and that we can plan ahead for? And then what is the responsibility, therefore, of businesses looking at things like skills and capabilities, looking at leaderships and behaviors and corporate cultures and governance? Many themes which have already been there, but the pandemic can be a real catalyst for. And these are also vital risk issues, because I'm sure I don't have to tell all of you that people are always at the center of risk. You know, what they do, whether they've got the right capabilities, how they're behaving, how you're aligning them. And they are at the absolute center, therefore, of the organizational response, of adaptability, sustainability, and reputation. So risk and people are intimately intertwined. And I always think about all the issues that I tend to talk about from the people side, which will be about things like engagement and well-being and skills development and the positive drivers of business change. Are also, of course, on the flip side of the coin, some of our biggest risk issues that we have in every organization. So what are some of the skills issues that we're already observing? Well, even before the pandemic, as you can see from this study, and there have been many like it from the Open University, and indeed we've studied these things ourselves as the CIPD, many organizations saying that they were already being held back because of skills shortages. And as you can see, that many of them saying that many organizations are not as agile as they needed to be because they couldn't access the skills they need. Now, we have in the UK some really interesting trends that have driven a lot of that, ranging from, if you look across OECD countries as a nation, we've underinvested in workplace training and development, and that has to change. We've also underinvested in technology in the workplaces in many ways, and somewhat bizarrely, we have one of the highest proportion of low-skilled jobs for a modern and advanced economy in the OECD countries. And now we're going through Brexit. You know, I've got to probably mention the B word and all of this as well. There's no doubt in my mind that it is accelerating businesses thinking about, well, if we had skills gaps before, we're going to see more of them because of the outcome of Brexit and because of some of the constraints and migration that have been talked about. And that is causing deep concern in many sectors, you know, construction, hospitality, healthcare and other industries that become and agriculture, which have become very dependent on accessing migrant talent. And then we can all debate why that's happened, but that is the fact of where we've, how our response to a lot of the skills shortages have emerged. Is we have been fortunate as a nation in many ways being able to attract a lot of migrant talent, but that picture, as we can all see, is likely to be changing. So other things then, as you look ahead, so that's, if you will, where we already were, but then looking ahead, and particularly this debate about the future of work and the impact of technology. I mean, this was a quote that came out from the CBI last week, that as many as 9 in 10 people currently work will need to be retrained or reskilled over the next 10 years. And that was based on McKinsey data. Now, that can look quite alarming. I mean, at one level, you could say, well, haven't we always needed to reskill and upskill? And I would say yes, and we haven't done enough of it. We have, as I said, we've underinvested in the workplace on skills development. We have underinvested in education, particularly in lifelong learning. And I was on a commission for the future of further education, which just reported last week, which called out as a sector further education, which has had a big role to play in things like lifelong learning and community learning, has been significantly underfunded, and we need to change that. And businesses need to work more with the educational system, particularly in more vocational education, through, for example, further education, to help us to address these skill shortages. So at one level, stats like this can look alarming, but they've always been there. I think what we are seeing, though, is an acceleration of the need to build skills, given all of the changes that we're expecting in the economy. Now, as I've already pointed out, some of those changes are happening because of the nature of technology and how automation is expected to affect different sectors. And you can see from this chart that, you know, some sectors like transportation, which is an interesting one, because also that's being affected quite a lot by the pandemic. But transportation, partly because, interestingly, of skills that you may not be so aware of that are in real short supply, have been things like truck drivers and lorry drivers. Now, the answer in many cases in transportation to address the skills shortages as well as efficiency and cost is actually more automation, more driverless vehicles and all of those sorts of things. In things like finance, it's a different kind of technology. It's much more about analytical and AI and machine learning type automation, which is the next big wave of automation, which is going to affect much more of these higher analytical type jobs that you'd see in things like financial services and the like. And indeed in medical. So you've got that sort of trend, which is going to exacerbate, as I said, some of the skills issues. But we've also got what's coming through the pandemic, and there's been growing levels of research on what are different sectors seeing from the pandemic. And again, it'll be obvious to all of you that some sectors are seeing a very severe impact in things like accommodation and food services, and hence, of course, with the most recent announcements on the lockdowns in England, a big reaction from those sectors because they're already hurting. Arts and entertainment, another. But at the other end, of course, things like basic services, utilities, information and communication, health and social work, education, we're not seeing a big shift in demand through the pandemic. And indeed, it's many of those sectors which are saying they need more help. So one of the questions that comes out of the pandemic, and it's a real question for the economy, but also for individual organizational resilience, is if we have a shortage in some areas of demand, but an increase in demand in other sectors, how can we move people across and between sectors, which we haven't historically been very good at? Because we tend to recruit on the basis of, well, the first thing I'm looking for perhaps is, do you have the skills that are needed in my sector, i.e. have you worked in my sector before? Now, many of the skills that have been talked about certainly the transferable skills are actually lists like this, are very human skills. And we're certainly talking to many organizations who've already been saying for a number of years that they're recruiting as much on attitude and aptitude as they are on the specific job skills, because they know they're going to have to invest in and develop the job skills as they change. But they want to know that they're building on a strong foundation of these very transferable skills. So we've been, as the CIPD, leading on a task force, which we call the Essential Skills Task Force, working with a number of groups, including Gatsby Foundation, Business in the Community, CBI and others, to say we need a more common language on that, because to help organizations to plug some of the skills gaps, to be more resilient, then we've got to focus on these transferable skills and then build from these. And I think you'd all recognize across these skills, these are things that matter to all of us, not just at the entry level of organizations, but indeed for the growth and capability of people right through the levels of any organization. And yet we haven't had a common language. So building a common language and then sharing that more across sectors, I think, is also a very important part of creating more economic resilience to these shocks in the system around skills gaps. So to summarize some of these thoughts, it's very much about how we see people. I mean, so people are at the center, as I said, of both risk and value. And historically, of course, we've talked an awful lot about people and measured them in these ways very much from a cost perspective, because we haven't been articulate enough on the value that people create. And indeed, that relates to, therefore, things like underinvestment in training, because we have an inherent challenge, particularly in the UK, of short-termism. And if I'm focused on the short term and more minded to be managing my short-term costs to maintain short-term profitability, then understanding things like investment and training, where I haven't got good measures of what are longer-term value outcomes, then that has constrained our investment in some of the things which are so essential to creating sustainable and resilient organizations. But within all of this debate about people are all these questions, which again are not new, but they are so fundamental to sustainable and effective organizations. So these ideas of, am I giving people voice? Am I listening to what's important to them? Am I recognizing them effectively? Am I building my organization from a sense of purpose, which is what drives and engages people? And there's been lots of behavioral science research over the years, which has clearly shown that the things that drive people's engagement, they're very much around ideas like purpose. Do I believe in the purpose of the organization? Is it doing good for the world? And do I understand my role in connection to that purpose? So ideas like that, ideas like autonomy, which give me more opportunity and control over what I do, and I'm not just operating to a sense of very narrowly defined rules. And indeed, the idea of mastery, are my skills being developed, and can I see my way to progression and development through my job, which sadly so many people, particularly in lower skilled jobs, not. And the three things I just called out there in terms of purpose, mastery, and autonomy, if you're interested in looking at those things further, they are the summation of a lot of behavioral science research on the ideas of engagement, which were very well pulled together by a guy called Dan Pink in a book called Drive, or The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. But they are all at this very central idea of putting people at the heart of our business thinking. And not least ideas now which, as I said, relate to things like well-being, of compassion, of caring for people in our organizations, and recognizing that that is the thing which people are probably looking for as much as anything else. And I'll show you a slide on that around leadership in a second. So to summarize a lot of these debates about the people issues of and building resilience in organizations around understanding skills and capabilities, where our gaps are and how we're going to build for the future, is very much encapsulated in this slide around strategic workforce planning. This is such an important agenda for businesses today. And if I'm honest, I don't think we've done a good enough job in really thinking ahead in all the different ways in which we can potentially build skills and address skills gaps and so forth. And this is something which we're talking a lot with our profession, the HR profession, about. But this is quite a neat model that Accenture developed, so buy, build, borrow, or bot. When you think about the skills and capabilities that you're going to need in the future, as we adapt our organizations, we invest in more technology and so on, we can buy them in, we can recruit people, we can build them, we can develop the skills and retrain and upskill people as we need to. We can borrow them, we can bring them in as contractors or partners or outsource parts of our business, or we can automate. And they are very big strategic questions, which is as important as any part of strategy for organizations today. And you cannot build a resilient organization for the future without understanding these kinds of questions. So going back to what I've already said, looking at things like the OU survey, leaders saying that they are already constrained in their ability to operate, to deliver on strategy, to execute, and to be agile because of skill gaps. And it really does require different thinking on our ability to plan ahead around the kinds of skills and capabilities that we're going to need. So then to move on, I'm just trying to make sure my clicker's working here because it doesn't seem to be. To move on to the next slide, that brings on this idea of inclusion. Now, we've seen a lot of debate about inclusion, of course, because the reality of things like Black Lives Matter and all of the racial inequalities that are so clearly out there, the difference of opportunities for people, and across all the different dimensions of diversity are societal issues, but they are also critical issues for business. And I'll highlight them from two perspectives. One, we need to create inclusive cultures to address the skills gaps and capabilities that I've talked about. And linked to that are these ideas as well, that it's about access to skills that we need. Innovation and creativity comes from different experience and different mindsets. And many businesses have failed in the past because they get stuck in a rut of groupthink. They're recruiting the same people. They're looking at the same paradigms of their businesses. They're talking to the same customer and consumer groups. And how many times have we seen that where businesses fail because they're not looking out, they're not bringing the diversity of experience to help them innovate, and that is compromising, therefore, their long-term strategy. And of course, things like community and customer connection are future-proofing. But those points also link to the second big idea about why inclusion is important. It's as much about reputation now as anything, because people expect, all our stakeholders are expecting to see businesses that are inclusive, that do build workforces that represent the communities, the customers, and the suppliers of which we are all part. So these are really, really critical and strategic business issues from a whole variety of perspectives, but building our cultures, our practices, ways that we recruit and develop people so that we really have inclusion embedded deeply in our organizational strategies is still a journey we're all on. So then to move it on into a couple of other aspects which builds on this thought of culture and behavior is what we have to do with leaders. How do we develop leaders to help create these sorts of cultures of inclusion and giving people voice and compassionate leadership and well-being? Well, at the end of the day, it's about leadership at every level. And again, I think in my experience of business over many years, this has been another point of failure for so many organizations. We have not invested enough in the core skills of people management at all levels of organizations. And instead, what we've historically tended to do is promote people for their technical competence, the best salesperson, the best computer programmer. And whilst, yes, of course, we need those technical competencies, it starts to build these real risks into organizations, our inability to build trust in organizations, to engage people effectively, because we're not managing them well enough. And particularly, as I said, through the pandemic, these sorts of issues have again come front and center. So part of the organizational response has to be, how do we build the capabilities of line managers and all the way through to the top to understand these issues around people, to manage people more effectively and give them voice and show that they have compassion and their interests at heart. And this survey and this research, which goes back a few years, but is still so relevant. When you look at the typical characteristics, when people are asked about leadership, what are they looking for in their leaders? They talk about integrity, competence, and benevolence. And what we've seen is a steady growth of the idea of benevolence as being a really, really important factor in what drives trust. Now, trust is arguably one of the most important aspects of organizational agility and response. My contention, and many others besides, is that you cannot drive positive change in organizations if you don't have trust. And trust has got to work down and it's got to work up. You've got to have leaders that trust their people. And I think a lot of aspects of old cultures, command and control, and lots of rule writing sends the signal to organizations, which we don't fundamentally trust you. And yet we talked about, paradoxically, empowerment for some years. And yet we built cultures that still too built on these ideas of lots of rules. And I've already mentioned the idea of things like autonomy as part of how you engage people. So you've got to create those cultures of trust going downwards. And oh my goodness, I think the pandemic's accelerated that as well. Let me take a good example of that, which is trusting people to be productive when you can't see them. We have, for a long time, had corporate cultures of presenteeism. It's one of the reasons, and we've done, again, a lot of research on this, as to why there is so much stress in the workplace, is because we built these cultures of presenteeism where people think that they just have to be there. They have to be working longer hours. They've got to answer their emails at all times of day and night and all those other things. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to, they're not going to be recognized in terms of their performance by their managers. So these are really, really fundamental questions about how we create trust in organizations in order to drive positive change and agility, which is so essential to resilient corporate cultures. And that goes a step further too. It's not just within organizations, it's trust beyond organizations. And this critical issue, which I think as risk people, you will see this. I mean, almost every survey I see of risk places ideas like corporate reputation at the top of the list, and it's driven by things like risk on cybersecurity, and everybody's terrified of, if I have a leak of data, I might be able to manage that leak, but the impact on my reputation could be really, really significant. And of course, we all know with cybersecurity, of course, technology is important, but the biggest risk is actually people. It's the so-called insider threat. But it's these other things, which I'm really getting at, and what this slide so clearly indicates, is that it's about the reputation of organizations and how they behave, and whether people believe that the organizations that they're dealing with as customers or they're supplying to, or who they might join as employees, are acting in a more collective interest. And this is data from the 29 Edelman Trust Barometer. And Edelman, one of the big PR agencies, have done these trust barometers for many, many years. And they've seen the steady decline in trust in the so-called establishment, in political leadership, in big business, in business leadership. And these sorts of demographics and data are really quite profound in what we have to address in building resilient corporate cultures and resilient business, which is good for society and good for economies as a whole. So that, I think, then sort of leads us into some of these ideas of one final point on Edelman's Trust Barometer. Really interesting also to note that what they talk about as the a shift of what we've always said, well, as long as you treat your customers well, everything's fine, to see that actually, if you treat your employees well, and that's what external people are saying of an organization, we want to see evidence that you're treating your people well. We want to see more transparency. We want to see that you are creating inclusive cultures. We want to see that you're training your people properly. We want to see that your pay gaps are being reported on effectively, and all those sorts of ideas. And if you treat your employees well, so many other things follow it. I mean, naturally, if you're treating employees well and you're empowering them, if you're empowering them effectively, they will also treat your customers well. So just to close then, I think it's brought about much more of these ideas, some external stakeholders onto businesses about these ideas, that they're looking for sustainability and resilience in organizations that capture many of the ideas that I've talked about, and hence this move towards a stronger expectation in investors and other stakeholders on environmental, social, and governance issues. And you can see here how much that's beginning to shift, which is good from my perspective. I think it is encouraging businesses to think in a much broader way about their responsibilities, what they need to be reporting on, and how they demonstrate to all of us that the things I've covered are things that they're actually addressing. So improve long-term returns, so long-term returns, not just short-term returns. This is about building long-term sustainability for organizations everywhere. And brand image and reputation, as I've already touched on, and therefore for them, decreased investment risk. So in summary, I think what I've tried to cover is in quite a rapid way, but a lot of these big questions about I think the need for a real change, of which the pandemic in many ways can really help the shift that has been going on for a number of years now, about putting people front and center, about understanding the skills and capabilities and how we build those to build resilient organizations, about behaviors, about cultures, about leadership capabilities, and then all the way through to corporate governance and transparency. And these ideas, which aren't new, but I think have so much resonance now, whether you call it people, planet, and prosperity, PPP, environmental and social governance issues, and these United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, or the multi-stakeholder views of businesses. And these are the things which I think will drive us all, hopefully, towards a better and more sustainable future. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't overrun. Maybe a minute or two at the end there, Julia, for any questions, and let me hand back to you.
So Peter, that was an incredibly rich session. And a lot of information there, which is really interesting for us to take away. And I have, you worked absolutely to time, but I'm going to allow an extra 5 minutes if you'll indulge us, because we've got some really good questions that have come in from our members. So one of the questions that's coming in is, shortlisting recruitment processes often require demonstrable skills and experience before shortlisting, reinforcing a lack of diversity. Do you have any views on what approaches businesses can take to widen the pool of individuals who are shortlisted, so that you focus on potential rather than history?
Yeah, very, very important question. I mean, the first is to broaden out your recruitment channels as widely as you can. I mean, I think in many sectors, and I would say not least insurance, we've tended to recruit from particular segments of the workforce. So getting into very different talent pools, it could be for people from very more disadvantaged backgrounds, for example, and opening those up. And you can open them up by looking at what you're recruiting for, based, as I said, perhaps more on some of those kinds of skills that I talked about, these very human skills. And not putting people off, because so much of our recruitment in the past has been, you look at the job advert and it'll say things like, you've got to have all these qualifications, all this experience, you must have worked in my sector, or indeed even the language. And there's some really good technology now that helps us understand the language in our recruitment adverts that could be male biased. When you use words like we're looking for go-getting or aggressive or words of that nature, they are gender biased words. So that's the place to start. You've got to open up your channels as wide as you can. You've got to slightly rethink what you're looking for in many ways. And then as you get to the shortlisting, encouraging that diversity through to the shortlisting and making sure that your recruitment and hiring managers and your HR teams are understanding that actually you expect to see a diverse shortlist. And there's been some really interesting research on this too. If I take recruiting more Black and ethnic minority people into our organizations, there was some very interesting research that I saw recently that suggested if you had a shortlist of say 5, 6, 7 people, and you only had one Black person on that list and the rest are all white, the chances of that Black person getting recruited were far less than the odds would have suggested on that shortlist, because there was a natural tendency for people to look at it and say, oh yeah, that's the token Black person, versus if you had 2 people of color on your shortlist, then people have already moved beyond that idea that it's just a tokenistic Black person. They've moved on to the idea, no, this is just part of a more diverse people group that I'm recruiting from. So it is a very, very important question, and we've all got to challenge ourselves on how we open up recruitment, how we use language which is more inclusive, how we tap into different pools of the workforce to recruit from, and how we then make sure that the recruitment practices and processes and shortlisting are as fair as they can be.
I think that's some great advice, and starting at the beginning of that food chain is a key message, and perhaps one that a lot of people don't focus attention on. I'm sort of going to turn to a couple of other questions, if we may, and one of those relates very much to the environment that we're in today, and has been raised along the lines of that staff fatigue is becoming more pressing in risk, in healthcare as a risk. How do we manage a risk that is often overlooked because we're short of skills and staff in the middle of a health crisis? I mean, there's a real dilemma there. Do you have any views as to how organisations are managing to sort of juggle those priorities?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important question. As I try to emphasize in my talk, I mean, this idea of well-being is a really, really fundamental thing for us, and always was, but the pandemic has accelerated that thinking. I mean, yes, not easy. I mean, the first thing I would say is you've got to encourage your managers to be communicating very regularly with all of your people. You know, are they sort of checking in? Are they beginning to pick up signals? And this is why we've also got to train them a bit, but picking up signals where there could be issues with our people. And I, for one, really do worry about these coming months. I mean, we've got through the first lockdown, it was all a bit novel and the weather was better and all the rest of it. These next few months, I think there's no way to escape, are going to be tough. And the thing we all have to watch out for is people's mental health and well-being. But I would, also point people to places where they can get additional support. Yeah, there's a lot of free material we have on our own website, the CIPD website. You can go to our website and look for mental health support. Go to things like the Mental Health at Work Gateway, which is supported by us and many other organisations, and particularly Mind, the mental health charity, and indeed Mind itself and ACAS, many others. There's a lot of good help out there for organisations and good advice on, without building massively complex programs, but just good core advice as to how to support your people, where you can also point them to what we think of as employee assistance programs and other mental health support which people need, because we as line managers cannot solve everybody's mental health issues. We can't train ourselves all to be mental health practitioners, but what we must be is people are open and understanding that these are real issues for people, checking in with them, and then where we can see they need help, pointing them to, as I said, it may be some of these external sources of help, or if you're in a bigger organization, I think you will all have these so-called EAPs, employee assistance programs, and other channels which we should be using.
Brilliant. Now, I'm going to ask you two other final short questions, if I may. One of them a little bit more strategic in a sense, and the other one I think is a very interesting angle, which I'm going to end on. The first one is organisations are continuing to face both known, as we call them, and emerging risks, which are all increasingly connected. Where would you rank people risk in today's environment amongst other business risks? And to what degree is it growing and impacting and shaping other risks?
Yeah, I mean, I think as I tried to illustrate through my talk, I have absolutely no doubt that the people risk is and has been growing for some time. You know, whether you look at it from all these skills issues, you look at it from behavioural and cultural alignment issues. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt it's been growing, and we haven't understood a lot of these risks well enough, as I said. And I think that's a collective concern. I mean, I would also, and as I do, challenge the HR profession to be much clearer on these risks, to have more of the data which can help to explain some of why these risks are so business critical, because we haven't enough seen them as business critical issues. And I was talking to a group yesterday, and we were just talking about things like, how much do the people and cultural issues appear on the board agenda? And I think any of us who've been around boards for a while or see the kind of agendas that are on, the answer is not enough. And a lot of HR people say, well, they usually end up as the last item on the agenda, on the end of the, I don't know, a long day of board meetings, and that time gets constrained down. Now, we've got to work with business leaders to understand these issues, and HR as the profession looking at many of these issues got to be more articulate on the risk issues around people. So I would say it's in the top three. I think most surveys I see of corporate risk and what business leaders see as real risk is at least in the top three. I mean, things like cybersecurity is right up there, but as I've already said, most of the risk of cybersecurity is actually about people. It's about often known as the insider threat. Skills is definitely right out there as one of the big risk issues. And of course, all this stuff that's going on around us now about economic sustainability and viability is going to come a lot back to, are you people aligned? Have you got them productive? Are they knowing what they're doing? How do you change the culture? How do you adapt your business? How do you restructure? And that's going to come back to people as well. So you might expect me to say it, Julie, as the HR guy, as it were, but I really profoundly believe these are central to the business risk agenda. But to put it into the positive, they're also absolutely central to the idea of responsible, sustainable businesses for the future. And we all need to take that on board, I think.
And Peter, I think that's a absolutely helpful answer for everyone who's on the session today. And I'm going to just end with a short question through maybe looking through the telescope the other way. And that is about, as we climb out of the current crisis, which at some stage we're going to have to, do you think the UK is facing a traditional jobs shortage? Where is the future employment going to come from to repay the huge fiscal repatriations that we all face due to the pandemic? So we're very focused on digital skills and future skills, but what about some of the more traditional skills? Do you see a job shortage crisis on those?
Yeah, I think there, as I said, there is already. I mean, if you go back to one of the slides I showed, I mean, it's really interesting to look at some of the sectors which have got much lower shift in, they've still got a lot of demand for skills, and it is things like social care and healthcare. Now, we've all seen and we've all been reminded through the pandemic that many of the jobs that we might have in the past sort of rather derided as lower skill or whatever and far less visible are the essential skills. The essential jobs. Now, those could be security guards, they could be truck drivers and van drivers and logistics workers, they could be healthcare and social workers, construction workers, and many others besides. And I think there is a real question to be asked here, because it troubles me that a lot of the debate about skills is so often said, well, it's all about high skills, it's all about giving everybody digital skills. I don't know if some of you saw it. It was known as the Fatima advert, but a couple of weeks ago, and I think it came out of the DWP or one of the government agencies, had an advert of a ballet dancer, and saying, it was a picture of a ballet dancer who apparently was called Fatima, and she didn't even know it was her picture being used instead, and said, well, of course, her future should be that she should retrain as a cyber digital expert. And that is arrant nonsense, and it was deeply patronising of somebody who's built their life around training in the arts, which we all need. I mean, my goodness, we need the arts more than ever, and to pretend that the only jobs that were worth having required people to make a shift of that order of magnitude, which is utterly unrealistic and crazy, is just madness. And we've got to get to a point where we're understanding that yes, of course, we've got to build some of these higher skills. It's not all about digital, which is why I called out these human skills. Focus more on those human skills, help everybody to have them, whether it's through FE or any other route, and then we'll build the job skills that we need, and that's the responsibility of business. But yes, this bigger debate of what the economy will need around essential workers that we have been very dependent on migrant workers for, that is something that I think will be one of the real challenges coming out of the pandemic, combined with Brexit, which has got to force us to focus a lot more on those kind of skills as well. And I think, again, that's a really collective agenda for us.
Peter, I think that's a great question to finish on. I'd like to thank you for being with us today. An extremely thought-provoking session. I can't begin to tell you how many questions have come through for you today, but you'd be with us very late into the day if we asked all of them, and we'll store those up and we'll put those into some of our future thought leadership at Airmic, and perhaps talk to the IPD about that too. Peter, thank you very much once again, and thank you for being with us.
No, my real pleasure, and I'd love to do more of these things again. I think there's a real need for a connection between our communities. So thank you, and good luck with the rest of the event.
Thank you very much.